Hi guys, follow along and let's read chapter 15 together, Poppers Performing Penguins. So just as a little refresher, we ended chapter 14 where the Poppers brought their penguins to the theater. They wanted to put on a penguin act. And so Mr. Greenbaum, which is the theater guy, he said, I'm ready to see what your penguins are all about. So in chapter 15, we're going to definitely hear about these penguins. At that moment, they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. What's the matter? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. The marvelous Marcos who closed the program haven't turned up, and the audience are demanding their money back. What are you going to do? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. Give it to them, I suppose. And here it is, Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money. I have an idea, said Mrs. Popper. Maybe you won't have to lose it. As long as it's the end of the program, why don't we just have the penguins rehearsed in there on a real stage? We'd have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it. All right, said the manager. Let's give it a try. So the penguins had their first rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, raising his hand, with your kind indulgence, we are going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos are unable to appear. We're going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper performing penguins instead. I thank you. In a dignified way, the Poppers and the penguins walked out on the stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. Aren't you going to take off your gloves to play? Asked the manager. Oh, no, said Mrs. Popper. I'm so used to playing with them that I'll keep them on if you don't mind. Then she started Schubert's Military March. The penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing their formations with great precision, until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. There's more to it, explained Mrs. Popper, half to the manager and half to the audience. Where they form in a hollow square and march in that formation. It's so late, we'll skip that tonight and jump to the second part. You're sure you don't want to take your gloves off, madam? Asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the penguins now formed in a semicircle as Nelson and Columbus in their midst put on a wild sparring contest. Their round black heads leaned far back so that they could watch each other with both round white eyes. Glurk, said Nelson, punching Columbus in the stomach with his right flipper, and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. Gah, said Columbus, going into a clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder as he tried to punch him in the back. Hey, no fair, said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose as the other 10 penguins looked on and applauded with their flippers. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him on the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud "Ork!" The other penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting, put down their flippers, and stood still facing each other. Which bird won? Who's ahead? Shouted the audience. Gork, said all the 10 penguins in the semicircle. This must have meant look, for Nelson turned to look at them, and Columbus immediately punched him in the stomach with one flipper and knocked him down with the other. Nelson lay there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted 10 over the prostrate Nelson, and again the 10 other penguins applauded. That's part of the act, explained Janie. The other penguins all like Columbus to win, and so they all say "Gok" at the end. That always makes Nelson look away, so Columbus can sock him good. Now Nelson rose to his feet, and all the penguins formed in a row and bowed to the manager. "Thank you," said the manager, bowing back. "Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. "Oh, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "you forgot to bring the 2 painting stepladders and the board." "That's all right," said the manager. "I'll get the stagehands to bring some." In no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up, with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece by the brook. At this point in the act, the penguins always forgot their discipline and got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at once to see which could be the first to climb the ladders. However, the children had always told Mr. Popper that the act was all the funnier for all this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the penguins fought and climbed the ladders and ran across the board in complete confusion, often knocking each other entirely off to the floor below, and then hurrying to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any penguins who were trying to climb up there. This part of the act was very wild and noisy in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and audience were all holding their sides laughing. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music and took off her gloves. "You'll have to get those ladders off the stage, or I'll never get these birds under control," said Mr. Popper. "The curtain is supposed to fall at this point." So the manager gave the signal for the curtain to go down, and the audience stood up and cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins. Then Janie and Bill began to cry, so the manager ordered several more, and everybody had one. Mr. Greenbaum was the first to congratulate the Poppers. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, that I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is a sensation, and the way you helped out my friend the manager here shows that you're real troopers, the kind we need in the show business. I'd like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters from Oregon to Maine." "And now to come to terms, Mr. Popper. How about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week?" "Is that all right, Mamma?" asked Mr. Popper. "Yes, that's very satisfactory," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well then, just sign these papers and be ready to open next Thursday in Seattle." "And thanks again," said the manager. "Would you mind putting on your gloves again for just a minute, Mrs. Popper? I'd like you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to look at those birds. It would be a lesson to them." And that's the end of our chapter. So that must have been a great scene. Imagine how excited they are to be receiving a $5,000. Remember when they were thinking $5 was a lot. Great chapter. So today's task is to find character traits. If you see this page here, so it'll open up in PowerPoint in the teams, in our teams assignments, okay? And you're going to have to add some text boxes here. So I already wrote the story for you, Mr. Popper's Penguins, and the character that we're going to analyze is Mr. Popper. So character traits means that these are words that describe somebody based on things they've done, things they've said, ways they act. For example, a person who tells the truth, well, a character trait of that person would be honest, right? So in this novel, we learn a lot about Mr. Popper. So I would like for you to open up the document that you've found online on the internet. if you haven't found it, I'll put it into our Teams so you can open it up. And I want you to search for 3 character traits that describe Mr. Popper. So I'm going to start you off here so you can have a refresher how to edit this. So you're going to go to Insert, okay, and you have to choose Text Box, okay. So you're going to insert a text box here, okay. Oops, I'm going to actually write my trait first. So I'm going to put my trait box here. Okay, there we go. Just start writing, put it right on the line there. So I'm going to say that Mr. Popper, one of his traits is that he is a daydreamer. And then I have to put some evidence from the text. So I have to find proof, okay? So I'm going to say that in the beginning of the novel, okay, and I can return to my Mr. Popper all the way at the beginning where he is, where Mrs. Popper is telling us that he is a daydreamer. So, and here it is. He's so absent-minded because he's always dreaming about faraway countries. So I'm going to go put that into my answer. So in the beginning of the novel, we learn that Mr. Popper is always, like we say en français, sur la lune. So always daydreaming about far away countries. So I'm going to leave this answer here for you. So I'm helping you out a little bit. I'm just changing my font, trying to make it fit onto the lines a little better. I think that's as good as I'll get it. That's okay. What I can do, if it's bugging you that there's lines, you can go to Shape Format and you can fill in with white and then we'll see it. Cool, huh? There we go, and that's what I'll do. So I'm going to leave that there. So you only have to find 3 more, okay? And don't forget to go look in the novel for your proof, your evidence from the text. As I've mentioned many times, if you have any questions, you can start a chat with me or we can video together and I can help you out. Okay? Good luck!